The house was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. She stood by the window, looking out into the dark expanse of the backyard, lost in thought. The weight of an unspoken loneliness settled over her like a heavy blanket. Marriage had turned into a routine, a cycle of empty gestures and cold silences. Her husband was a good man, responsible, successful, but distant. He had become more of a presence than a partner. She sighed, adjusting the thin strap of her nightgown. The house was too large, too empty, despite being filled with expensive furniture and carefully curated decor. It was a life built for appearances, but inside, it lacked warmth. A noise behind her made her turn. She hadn't heard him come home. The front door closed softly, and moments later, footsteps echoed through the hallway. Then, a voice, deeper than she remembered. "Hey, I didn't think you'd still be up." She turned to see him standing at the doorway, duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He had grown since she last saw him. Broader shoulders, sharper features, an air of quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The boy who had left for college had returned a man. "You're back early." "Yeah, caught an earlier flight." She nodded, offering a small smile. "Your father's asleep." "Of course he is," he muttered under his breath, setting his bag down. A familiar tension filled the space between them. Their relationship had always been complicated. She had entered his life when he was already in his late teens, and while there was never open hostility, there was never warmth either. He tolerated her presence but never embraced it. And yet, standing there in the dimly lit room, something had shifted. The way he looked at her wasn't dismissive. There was something else, something unreadable in his gaze. She cleared her throat. "You must be tired. I'll let you settle in." He didn't respond right away, just watched her for a beat longer than necessary. Then finally a nod. "Good night." She turned quickly, retreating down the hallway, heart beating faster than it should. The next morning, she moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, brewing coffee, slicing fruit, mind occupied with a million little thoughts that all seemed to circle back to the night before. The way he looked at her. She pushed the thought aside as he entered, stretching, shirtless, his sweatpants hanging low on his hips. It wasn't unusual. He had always been comfortable in his own skin. But today, it felt different. "Morning," he said, grabbing a glass of water. "Morning," she replied, focused on pouring coffee. "Dad gone already?" "As always." She handed him a cup, avoiding his gaze. He took a sip, then leaned against the counter, watching her. "You don't have to keep pretending." She froze. "Pretending what?" "That everything's fine." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You're lonely." Her breath caught, but she forced herself to smile. "That's a bold assumption." His lips twitched. "It's not an assumption. It's obvious." She turned away, busying herself with a dish in the sink. His presence was too close, too aware. It wasn't the first time someone had noticed the distance between her and her husband, but coming from him, it felt different. "I'm fine," she said too quickly. Silence. Then, a low chuckle. "If you say so." The sound sent a shiver up her spine. Days passed, and she found herself growing more aware of him. The way he moved through the house, the way his gaze lingered when he thought she wasn't looking. It was unnerving, the way he could read her so easily, as if he saw through the carefully constructed walls she had built. One evening, she stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around herself, humming softly. She reached for the door, expecting an empty hallway. But when she opened it, he was there. For a moment, neither moved. His eyes flickered down, then back up, an unreadable expression crossing his face before he looked away. "Sorry, She took a step back, gripping the towel tighter. "It's fine." He didn't move. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. She closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. Dinner that night was quiet, the air thick with something unspoken. Her husband barely noticed, absorbed in his phone, responding to work emails between bites. She caught him watching her across the table. The weight of his stare made her skin prickle. After dinner, she sat on the couch, pretending to read. He walked past, pausing for a fraction of a second, close enough that she could feel his body heat. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Her fingers gripped the book tighter. This was dangerous. The next afternoon, she was in the kitchen when he came in, a towel slung over his shoulder, fresh from a workout. He opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, then leaned against the counter. "You okay?" She looked up, startled. "What? You seem distracted." She exhaled. "I'm fine." A pause. Then, "You don't have to pretend with me." She froze, fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. His voice was low, steady. "I see you. I always have." Her breath hitched. This was wrong. He was too close, the air too thick, the space between them too small. She stepped back, breaking the moment. "I need to go." His eyes flickered, but he nodded. She turned, walking away before she did something she couldn't take back. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The night was quiet, the house still, but she was restless. Sleep evaded her. Thoughts tangled in a dangerous web of guilt and desire. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew better. There was a shift between them, an invisible current pulling them closer despite every logical reason to resist. She stepped into the kitchen for water, the cool tile grounding her. Then, she felt it, his presence before she even turned. He stood there in the dim light, watching her, arms crossed over his chest. "Can't sleep." His voice was softer than usual. She swallowed. "No." He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. The air between them felt charged, humming with something unspoken. "Why?" She gripped the glass tighter. "I don't know." A lie. They both knew. He exhaled, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. "You do." Her pulse raced. "You should go to bed." "So should you." He didn't move. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, heavy and thick. Then he reached out, fingertips grazing the back of her hand, barely touching, but enough to send a shiver up her spine. She should have pulled away. She didn't. His fingers trailed higher, brushing against her wrist, a featherlight touch that burned more than it should have. "This is wrong," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then stop me." His gaze locked onto hers, unrelenting. She should have. She didn't. He leaned in, close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin. Her heartbeat thundered, everything inside her screaming to run, to break the moment before it shattered everything. But she stayed. The first kiss was hesitant, a whisper of lips that barely touched. She could have pretended it didn't happen. But then he moved, deepening it, and suddenly, there was no going back. Her body responded before her mind could protest. Fingers in his hair, his hands on her waist, pulling her closer. The room spun, the world shrinking until it was just them. Then reality crashed in. She pulled away, breathless, shaking. "No." His jaw tightened, his breathing uneven. "No." She shook her head, stepping back. "This can't happen." He didn't argue. He just watched her, eyes dark, unreadable. Then finally he nodded. "Okay." She turned and walked away, not looking back. But the damage was done. The next morning, the house felt different. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. She avoided his gaze, busying herself with meaningless tasks. Her husband sat at the table, oblivious, scrolling through emails between bites of toast. He entered the room, silent, his presence heavier than it should have been. She could feel his gaze, the weight of what had happened pressing against her chest. She turned, forcing a smile. "Coffee?" He didn't answer right away. Then finally a nod. "Yeah." She poured him a cup, careful not to touch him, not to linger. His fingers brushed hers as he took it. A deliberate touch, a reminder. Her breath hitched. She pulled away quickly, pretending nothing had happened, pretending she wasn't falling apart inside. The days passed in slow torture. The tension between them thickened, unbearable. She tried to stay away, but he was always there. Always watching. Always too close. Then came the storm. The rain pounded against the windows, the wind howling through the empty halls. Her husband was away on business, the house too quiet, too intimate. She sat by the fireplace, a book in her lap she wasn't reading. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps, slow, measured. He stood there in the doorway, watching her. She should have told him to leave. She didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, crossing the room in 3 slow strides. He knelt in front of her, taking the book from her hands, setting it aside. She couldn't breathe. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, voice raw, stripped of all pretense. Her eyes burned. "Don't." "Why?" "Because it's wrong." He reached up, fingertips tracing her jaw, tilting her face toward his. "Then tell me to go." She opened her mouth. No words came. His lips brushed against hers, slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. The kiss deepened, hunger replacing hesitation. Hands roamed, bodies pressed together, months of tension igniting into something uncontrollable. She gasped as he lifted her, carrying her to the couch, their world unraveling in soft moans and whispered names. Guilt would come later, regret would follow, but in that moment nothing else existed. The morning after was suffocating. Sunlight streamed through the windows, cutting through the remnants of the night before, forcing reality upon her. She sat on the edge of the bed, legs curled beneath her, staring at the door as if expecting him to walk in at any moment. But he didn't. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy with something she wasn't ready to name. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the feeling. The warmth of his touch still lingered on her skin, a ghost of something she couldn't allow herself to hold on to. This was a mistake. It had to be. But why didn't it feel like one? She forced herself to move, to push past the weight pressing down on her. A shower, fresh clothes, a cup of coffee. Small things to reclaim a sense of normalcy. But nothing felt normal anymore. Then he appeared. She looked up, startled, as he leaned against the kitchen doorway, watching her in silence. His gaze held no regret, no hesitation, only certainty. She gripped the counter. "We can't do this." He didn't move, didn't look away. "We already did." A sharp breath. "It can't happen again." A pause. Then he stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "Tell me you don't want it to." She should have. She should have said the words, drawn the boundary. But her silence betrayed her. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a shiver up her spine. "You don't have to lie to me." Her resolve cracked. "This is wrong. So stop me." His voice was quiet, daring. She swallowed hard. But then the front door opened, and the moment shattered. Her husband walked in, setting his briefcase down, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. She stepped back quickly, forcing a smile, forcing normalcy. Her hands trembled as she handed him his coffee. She felt his gaze on her, unwavering, unrelenting. This wasn't over. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt him. His hands, his mouth, the way he made her feel things she had no right to feel. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. Her heart pounded as she stood, hesitating for a moment before opening it. He was there, shirtless, eyes dark with something dangerous. She exhaled sharply. "What are you doing?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You know what?" Her pulse raced. "You can't be here." He stepped closer, until the space between them vanished. "Do you want me to leave?" "Yes." She should have said yes. But when his hands found her waist, pulling her closer, all the air left her lungs. She was losing control, and she didn't want to stop. The next few days were torture. Stolen moments, hidden glances, touches that lingered too long. Every time she told herself it was the last time, but it never was. She was spiraling, drowning in something she couldn't escape. Then came the close call. She was in the bedroom, door slightly ajar, his hands on her, lips trailing down her neck. She arched into him, fingers digging into his shoulders, lost in the haze of desire. Then, footsteps. They froze. Her husband's voice carried from down the hall. She shoved him away, panic clawing at her chest. Go! He hesitated. Now! He slipped out the side door just as the bedroom door opened. Her husband walked in, glancing around. Hey, you okay? She forced a smile, ignoring the racing of her heart. Yeah, just tired. He nodded, oblivious. I was thinking we should go away for a few days. Just us. Her stomach dropped. What? A trip. We haven't spent much time together lately. Guilt crashed over her like a tidal wave. She nodded quickly. Yeah, that sounds nice. But when she glanced toward the door he had just slipped through, she knew this wasn't going to end well. She stared at her reflection, searching for a version of herself that no longer existed. The woman who once felt secure, who knew where the lines were, was gone. In her place stood someone unrecognizable, someone trapped between guilt and desire, between consequences and temptation. Her husband was packing in the other room, excited about their trip. He had no idea she was coming undone. No idea that the person he trusted most had already betrayed him in ways she couldn't take back. She should tell him, end this before it got worse. But then her phone buzzed. A single message. Come outside. Her pulse spiked. She glanced toward the bedroom where her husband was zipping up his suitcase. Oblivious. She shouldn't go. But she did. Outside, he was waiting, leaning against his car, arms crossed. His expression unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. She swallowed hard. What are you doing here? You're really leaving with him? She hesitated. I have to. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Because you want to, or because you feel guilty? She looked away. This isn't fair. What isn't? He stepped closer, voice low. That I make you feel something? Her breath caught. You don't love him. The words were a quiet challenge. She flinched. Don't say that. Why not? It's the truth. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. Finally, he exhaled. Come with me instead. Her stomach twisted. I can't. Yes, you can. His hand brushed against hers. You just don't want to. A car door slammed in the distance, jolting her back to reality. She stepped away quickly, shaking her head. I have to go. She turned and walked back inside without looking back. The trip was meant to fix things, to repair the growing distance between her and her husband. But it was too late. She lay beside him in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing. Her husband reached for her, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. I love you, he murmured. She closed her eyes. I love you too. A lie. The moment they returned home, everything unraveled. The secrecy, the guilt, the weight of it all, it was too much. She met him one last time, in the quiet of the night, knowing this had to end. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. He studied her, searching for cracks in her resolve. You don't mean that. Tears burned her eyes. I do. He stepped forward, hands gripping her arms, voice raw. So that's it? You're just going to pretend this never happened? She swallowed back the lump in her throat. We were never supposed to happen. Silence. Then finally he nodded. If that's what you want. It wasn't. But she walked away anyway. Her husband never found out. But the damage was done. She lay beside him every night, wearing the mask of a faithful wife, pretending she wasn't haunted by the memory of another man's touch, pretending she hadn't already lost herself.